The wind battered Windmere Cottage with a mournful cry, its stone walls groaning under the weight of a rising storm. Perched alone on the moor's edge like a forgotten relic, the cottage had stood vacant for nearly 2 years, until this week. The lights had returned. The smoke from its chimney curled up once more into the grey sky, and with it, life, or something resembling it, had returned to Windmere. It was the local postmistress, Beryl Simmons, who first sensed something amiss. On Tuesday, she had trudged up the hill in her raincoat, delivering a parcel addressed to a Mr. Martin Fielding. He had received it with a courteous smile and little else, no idle chat, no inquiry about the village. Odd, she thought, considering newcomers usually made polite attempts to blend in. Still, she dismissed it until the very next morning when, upon her return with the registered letter, she found the door ajar and the interior quiet as the grave. Martin Fielding was dead. He lay slumped in the drawing-room chair, eyes wide and unseeing, a faint trickle of blood down his temple. The French windows behind him were locked from the inside. No weapon was visible, and aside from a shattered teacup, at his feet the room was untouched. The fire in the hearth had burned low, casting flickering shadows on the floor, and above it, on the mantelpiece, rested an old, faded photograph in a tarnished frame, an image of a woman smiling beside a much younger Martin. The coroner's initial report listed blunt force trauma, though no object in the house seemed to match the wound. No footprints outside, no signs of struggle, and no forced entry. The front door had been locked, keys still in Fielding's coat pocket. A locked room, a man alone, and a fatal injury with no weapon. It was, as the local constable remarked with a touch of helplessness, a bloody ghost story. It was only natural that someone suggested bringing in Miss Marple. She arrived with little fanfare, a day after the inquest adjourned with no ruling. The police had not ruled it a murder, but they had not ruled it anything else either. And in St. Mary Mead, a whisper of mystery was more than enough to stir Miss Marple into action, especially when an old friend had written to her, concerned. The friend was Beryl Simmons, of course. Everyone in the village had known Beryl since she was a child. Windmere Cottage welcomed her with a chill. She stood quietly in the doorway, glancing around with her gloved hands folded, absorbing the room's silence. The villagers had left everything untouched, out of deference, or perhaps fear. The chair still bore a dark stain on its right arm. The broken teacup had been swept aside and placed in a tray on the kitchen table. She examined it without touching. China, she noted, but not part of a set. The other cups bore a floral pattern. This one was plain white. Odd thing to serve a guest with the odd cup out, she murmured. The constable, young and eager to please, watched her shuffle through the sitting room. No one saw anyone visit him that night. No one heard a sound. The weather was awful, and the place is so isolated, even if someone had screamed. Yes, Miss Marple said absently, squinting at the photograph on the mantel. And yet someone was here. A man does not strike himself fatally on the temple and then lock the French windows behind him. She paused. The fire had been stoked recently, perhaps within the hour before his death. There were 2 logs laid precisely, yet only one had burned. A kettle sat beside the hearth untouched, and the faint aroma of chamomile lingered in the bar. She asked about the tea bags. The constable led her to the kitchen drawer. All the tea bags were accounted for except chamomile. There were none at all. Miss Marple frowned. She examined the front door next. Solid oak, a heavy latch, and no signs of tampering. The windows were intact. No footprints in the garden, though with the rain any such evidence might have washed away. Still, she thought, the scene felt too neat, too complete. A locked room puzzle presented with the clarity of theatre. She visited the post office next, sipping weak tea as Beryl recalled her brief encounters with the deceased. He kept to himself. Polite, always. Had an odd accent. Not quite local, not quite London either. I thought him sad, like he carried something with him, if you get my drift. And this parcel he received. What was it? Miss Marple asked gently. Beryl blushed. I'm not supposed to say, you know. But between us, it was a leather journal, old, wrapped up like it was delicate. I peeked at the label, sent from an address in Cornwall. That detail stirred something in Miss Marple's memory. She didn't say it aloud, not yet, but the name Martin Fielding meant something. She returned to the cottage and rummaged through his modest bookshelf. There, tucked beside a collection of maritime histories, she found a slim volume, The Tragedy at Rosemir Hall. A true crime account, long out of print. She opened it and found a newspaper clipping tucked inside. Suspect in Rosemir case cleared after 12 years. The man in the photo was younger but unmistakable. Martin Fielding had been the accused. It came back in fragments. A young maid, dead under suspicious circumstances. Her employer's son, Martin, had been the last to see her alive. A case that shocked Cornwall in the early 1930s. No charges ever stuck. The case remained unsolved, though rumours haunted him for years. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. That night, as wind howled again through the moors, she sat alone in Windmere Cottage with only the fire for company. She studied the photograph on the mantel again. The woman beside Fielding looked familiar. In a sudden flash it came to her. The same woman had been pictured in the Rosemir Hall book. It was the maid. Fielding had kept her photo for all these years. Why? She rose, checking the photograph's frame. The back opened easily. Tucked inside was a note, brittle with age. A single line, scrawled in desperate ink. I didn't mean for her to fall. She slipped. Please, forgive me. Miss Marple sat down, heart fluttering. A confession. But to whom? The next morning she summoned the constable and asked to review the journal that had arrived before Fielding's death. After some wrangling, it was handed to her. Page after page of tormented handwriting, detailing dreams, guilt, visions of the maid's face at night. The last entry read, She visits me still, I cannot stand it any more. The tea will do the rest. The plain white cup, the missing chamomile. She looked up. He poisoned himself. The constable blinked. But the head injury... Miss Marple held up the journal. Read it carefully. He staged it. Wanted it to look like an attack. Perhaps to punish himself one final time. Or to mislead. But there was no struggle. The tea was laced. He brewed it, drank it, and once the effects began, perhaps he struck his head on the chair's arm in collapse. The wound looks brutal, but the poison was already at work. And so, the unsolvable crime unravelled, not through footprints or blood, but through the subtle clues of guilt, memory, and the bitter weight of time. Windmere Cottage returned to silence once more, its truth whispered only among the heather and stone. The village of Little Davington settled uneasily in the days that followed Martin Fielding's death. The official word, an apparent suicide, was accepted by most, if not understood. To many, the idea of a man going to such theatrical length to end his life seemed too far-fetched. And while the police were content to close the case, Miss Marple was not. Her instincts whispered that the curtain had not yet truly fallen. Something about Fielding's final act tugged at her. It wasn't just the confession or the staged scene. It was the presence of something else, something she couldn't quite name, like a piece missing from a jigsaw, the gap almost invisible, yet undeniable once seen. She returned to Windmere Cottage, this time alone. The air inside had gone still, heavy with the scent of soot and something older, paper perhaps, or time itself. She walked slowly through the rooms, listening not with her ears, but with her memory. People left impressions in their homes, trails not always visible. In the corner of the study she paused. The floorboards here had a different sound beneath her steps. Kneeling with effort, she pressed gently. One of the boards gave slightly. Not loose, but disturbed. A small thing, not enough to draw police attention, but enough for someone with a keen eye. She fetched a letter opener from the desk drawer and pried the board loose. Beneath it, wrapped in oilskin, was a parcel, flat, carefully sealed. She laid it on the desk and peeled back the layers to reveal a collection of photographs. Old, faded, all of the same woman, the maid from the Rosemir Hall case. Yet these were more personal, more intimate than any she'd seen before, smiling by the sea, sitting on a stone wall, reading in the garden, and in each photo, always the same pendant around her neck, a delicate silver locket shaped like a rose. But something else was tucked in with the photographs, a more recent image, a grainy print, taken in secret, it seemed. The same pendant, the same woman. Only this time she appeared older, grey at the temples, thinner. The photo was dated 4 months ago. Miss Marple sat back, chilled. The maid had died nearly 30 years ago. Or so everyone had believed. She carried the photograph with her to Beryl Simmons that evening. The postmistress, though startled, examined it carefully. "Oh, that's her," she said. "She's been around a few times these past months. Always asked if anything came for Mr. Fielding. Never gave a name. Quiet sort. Sad eyes." "Did she say where she was staying?" "Just passing through. Said she was visiting family. I figured she was a niece or something." Miss Marple felt the picture in her hand grow heavier. If the woman hadn't died, what exactly had happened at Rosemir Hall all those years ago? She sent a discreet wire to Inspector Craddock, who owed her more than a few favours. His reply, when it came, was brief. No record of body recovered. Maid presumed drowned. Case closed. Martin Fielding left country soon after. And now Martin was dead. By his own hand, perhaps. But the presence of this woman, the shadow of her reappearance, complicated everything. The next morning, Miss Marple stood again in the drawing-room of Windmere Cottage, this time with Craddock at her side. He was a man of reason, but he'd learned never to dismiss Miss Marple's hunches out of hand. "Could she really have survived all this time?" he asked, looking again at the photograph. "She could have," Miss Marple replied quietly. "And if she did, she might have come here, not for vengeance, perhaps for answers, or forgiveness." Craddock considered that. "You think she was here the night he died?" "I think she was here not long before. But if she saw him die, or knew he intended to, it might explain her disappearance. They questioned the villagers this time. More pointedly, most had nothing new to add, but the boy who worked at the grocer's, recalled something curious. "There was a lady," he said. "Came in twice, wore a long scarf, never spoke much, bought chamomile tea, I remember that, because she asked if it was calming." "When was this?" "Couple of days before Mr. Fielding died. Then again the night before. Looked flustered. Didn't say why." Miss Marple exchanged a glance with Craddock. A second visit. That detail was new. Later that day, as the sun broke, briefly through the clouds, Miss Marple walked the perimeter of the cottage garden, taking slow steps through the withered heather. Her eyes, always sharp, caught a glint near the far end, half buried in the soil. She crouched and brushed it clean, a rose-shaped silver locket. Not just any locket, the one from the photographs. It had been deliberately hidden, the chain tucked, under a rock. Almost ritualistically, as if placed in memory or mourning, she opened it. Inside, a scrap of paper was folded tight, almost brittle with damp. 4 words were scrawled in faded pencil. "I am still here." She did not show it to Craddock immediately. She needed time to think, to pull the threads tighter. The suicide had been real. Of that she was now certain. But the presence of the woman, alive, silent, and then gone again, added a second layer to the mystery. And then there was the oddest detail of all, Martin Fielding's luggage. While going over the inventory provided by the local constable, Miss Marple noted something peculiar. The clothing was standard: toothbrush, shaving kit, a few novels. But no return ticket, no timetable, no map. For a man who'd only just arrived days before his death, there was nothing to suggest a plan to go elsewhere. No letters, no travel arrangements. It was as if he had come only to end something, but then why receive the journal? And who sent it? The parcel had come from Cornwall, and in Cornwall, Rosemir Hall still stood, a faded estate, now part museum, part ruin. She made the decision quickly, with the resoluteness of someone who knew the trail would not remain warm for long. "I think," she said to Craddock that evening, "we must go to Rosemir, because whatever haunted Martin Fielding did not end here. And if this woman is still alive, if she came to see him, someone else may have seen her." Craddock hesitated. "You believe she didn't just visit him?" Miss Marple turned to the window, watching the moor darken again. "I believe she came to forgive him, and found he'd already passed judgment on himself. But someone else may not be so forgiving, especially if that journal revealed more than we realize." Outside, the wind whispered again through the heather. Inside, the fire crackled low. The chilling truth of Windmere Cottage was only beginning to stir. The journey to Cornwall passed in heavy silence, broken only by the quiet hum of the train and the occasional rustle of Miss Marple's shawl as she turned pages in Martin Fielding's journal. She read carefully, each line revealing more of a man fractured by guilt and fear. But guilt was not always the whole truth. Sometimes it was a mask, a shadow cast to obscure something else entirely. By the time they arrived at Rosemir, the sea mist had rolled in thick curling around the remains of the estate like ghostly fingers. The hall itself was a husk of its former grandeur, one wing boarded up, the gardens overgrown. But a modest portion had been converted into a museum maintained by a trust and staffed by a small local team. Miss Marple and Inspector Craddock were greeted by the curator, a thin, sharp-featured woman named Ellen Grafton. She wore the air of someone who lived too long among relics and secrets. "I remember Martin," she said, as she led them through a narrow hallway lined with portraits and fading wallpaper. "He came back here briefly about a year ago. Said he was doing research, asked after the girl." "The girl being Lydia Marsh?" Miss Marple asked, carefully watching the woman's expression. "Yes. Lydia, the maid who vanished, drowned, or so we were told, though no body was ever found. Everyone just wanted it to be over." "Did you see him again?" Ellen hesitated. "No, but he wrote, asked for photographs, documents. He seemed obsessed." "Would you happen to know if anyone else visited recently asking about Lydia?" At this, Ellen's eyes narrowed slightly. "There was someone, a woman, soft-spoken, maybe in her 50s. She came by last month. Said she was doing family research. I thought she looked familiar, but I couldn't place her." Miss Marple produced the grainy photograph they'd recovered. Ellen stared at it for a long time before nodding. "Yes, that's her." "Did she give a name?" "No. But she asked many questions about Lydia's last day here, about Martin. She seemed moved, but not surprised by anything." As they walked on, Craddock stayed close to Miss Marple. "What do you make of her?" he asked under his breath. "She notices far too much to be as indifferent as she appears," she murmured. "And she knew that woman. Perhaps not well, but well enough to lie about it." The next person they spoke to was one of the estate's long-time caretakers, a man named Harold Nixby. He'd served the Fieldings for decades and now lived in a small cottage on the property. "Martin?" He scoffed when asked. "I never trusted that one. Always had something behind the eyes, if you understand me." "But you worked for his family?" "His father, mostly. The boy left when things got bad. Never came back. Until that letter. Last year, and then he turned up, poking about. Kept asking about the cliff path." "The same path where Lydia was said to have fallen?" "That's the one. He went out there alone, stood by the edge for hours." Miss Marple tilted her head. "And did you see anyone else with him?" Nixby paused. "Funny you should ask. There was a woman, small, pale, looked like she didn't belong. They met by the chapel ruins. I didn't hear what was said, but she left in tears." "Do you know where she went?" "No idea. Disappeared, like fog. But she came back, I think, the night before Martin left. I saw a light in the old gardener's shed. Next morning it was out. Was anything taken? Disturbed?" "Not that I noticed, but—" He hesitated. "Someone's been leaving flowers there. Wild roses. Just one. Always the same." Miss Marple felt the threads tug again. A hidden woman. A mourning gesture. A memory marked in petals. Back in the village, they visited the local lodging house, where Martin had stayed during his brief visit. The landlady, Mrs. Clements, was a blunt, red-cheeked woman who wasted no time in airing her suspicions. "He wasn't right," she said, arms folded. "Didn't sleep, kept his curtains closed, and the books he carried, morbid things, about guilt, punishment, seemed like he was waiting for something." "Did anyone visit him?" "One person. A woman, middle-aged, sad face. She brought him a package. I thought she was his sister at first." Miss Marple glanced at Craddock. Another package. Another quiet visit. "Did you happen to hear anything they said?" "I try not to listen through doors," Mrs. Clements said, though her tone betrayed otherwise. "But she said something odd. Told him it was time. That he had to see it for what it was." He just nodded. Craddock scribbled notes. "Could you describe her more clearly?" "She had a limp. faint. Hard to notice unless you watched her leave. Wore a lavender scarf. Another detail. Another person slipping through the village like a ghost. By late afternoon, the pieces had begun to twist, though not yet fall into place. 3 witnesses, 3 fragments of the same woman, quiet, grieving, determined, and each hinting at something deeper than a chance return. Lydia Marsh, presumed dead, had walked again through the grounds of Rosemir, and someone had helped her stay hidden. Back at the hall, Miss Marple asked to see the estate's archives. Ellen Grafton obliged, though with evident reluctance. She watched from the shadows as Miss Marple sifted through records, old staff ledgers, photographs. "What was your role here when Lydia disappeared?" Miss Marple asked without looking up. "I was just starting," Ellen replied too quickly. "Assistant to the housekeeper, I barely knew her." "And yet you recognized her face, after 30 years. A pause. Ellen's mouth set into a thin line. "She was kind to me, but after she vanished, no one dared speak her name. Martin was protected. Everyone said she had no business being with someone like him." "You believed she died? Wanted to believe it?" Ellen said softly. "But when that woman came back last month, I knew. You don't forget someone like Lydia." "Then why lie to us?" "Because I promised her I wouldn't tell. She said she only wanted to speak to Martin. One last time." Miss Marple's gaze lingered. "Did she?" Ellen hesitated. "I don't know. I think so. He left that same night. Looked like a man who'd seen a ghost." It was nearly dark when they returned to the station. Craddock exhaled slowly. "So, Lydia is alive." She confronted him, maybe forgave him, and then vanished again. "Not quite," Miss Marple said, her voice thin with tension. "There's one contradiction that troubles me. Everyone describes Lydia as quiet, sad, alone. But she came to deliver that journal. And inside were more than memories. There were accusations about someone else who was there that night." Craddock frowned. "You think she wasn't the only witness?" "No," Miss Marple said. "I think Lydia knew more than she ever said. And someone knew what she knew. Someone who followed her to Windmere. Someone who made sure Martin couldn't tell the rest of the story." As the train rumbled back toward Little Davington, the fields turned black beneath the falling dusk. Somewhere, the final truth waited, quiet and coiled, like a serpent in tall grass. By the time Miss Marple and Inspector Craddock returned to Little Davington, the village had retreated into the folds of early autumn. The heather had dulled, the wind had turned sharp, and Windmere Cottage stood silent, still a monument to a death that looked so tidy and now so clearly was not. The police had done their part, but as Miss Marple quietly re-entered the study and sat once again by the cold fireplace, she knew the answers would not come from reports or statements. They would come from something smaller, something misaligned, a story that didn't quite fit, however polished it seemed. Craddock, too, was unsettled. He had asked the local constable to revisit everyone who'd interacted with Martin Fielding in his final days, and one by one, the names began to resurface. Each had a reason to speak with Martin. Each claimed their visit had been brief, uneventful. But none of them mentioned Lydia. Not once. Miss Marple began with Ellen Grafton back in Cornwall. The woman had confessed to knowing Lydia had returned, but she had also insisted she hadn't seen them together. She said she only wanted to speak with him, Ellen had claimed, And yet the journal, the damning intimate document, had somehow made it into Martin's hands. Was it truly Lydia who delivered it, or was someone else playing messenger? Then there was Harold Nixby, the old caretaker. He had admitted to seeing a woman meet Martin at the chapel ruins, but his recollection had been curiously vague. He hadn't been sure it was Lydia, hadn't described her face, just the sadness about her. Why the imprecision? Miss Marple suspected that sadness had been added after the fact, a detail meant to imply remorse, to soften what may have been something much more dangerous. The deeper she looked, the more inconsistencies appeared. Not great fractures, but hairline cracks. Mrs. Clements, the landlady, said Martin received only one visitor. But Beryl Simmons, the postmistress, had seen 2 different women come asking after Fielding. One was the quiet one, the presumed Lydia, but the other had worn gloves, spoke crisply, and left no name. A woman of means. A woman. Who wasn't grieving? Who was she? Miss Marple had a quiet tea with Beryl again, this time not asking questions, but gently chatting about deliveries, parcels, postmarks. I remember it, Beryl said eventually, unprompted. The woman in gloves. Odd, now I think on it. She mailed something, didn't she? A brown envelope, special post. I assumed it was bills. Do you remember the address? Oh, yes, Beryl said with a faint smile. I have a memory for numbers. It was to Fielding, Windmere Cottage, Little Davington. Same day he arrived. Miss Marple's hand paused on her teacup. So Martin didn't bring the journal with him. It was sent. Beryl nodded. Just hours before he got off that train. That changed things. If Lydia had come to see him, she hadn't brought the journal, someone else had. And they'd made sure it arrived ahead of him. Back at Windmere, Miss Marple asked Craddock to retrieve the envelope from evidence. It was plain, unremarkable, but the handwriting was sharp and practiced. Masculine, possibly, but elegant. And inside, a single faint fingerprint, too smudged to trace. Craddock frowned. If Lydia didn't deliver this herself, and didn't write the confession, someone else is orchestrating it. Or burying something, Miss Marple murmured. This journal could be the truth, or a trap. She asked for copies of the original Rosemir investigation, the one 30 years prior. Most of it was routine. The Fieldings claimed Lydia was mentally unstable, had shown signs of infatuation with Martin, and had thrown herself from the cliffs when spurned. No body was ever found, no note. But the testimony of one person stood out, a former housekeeper named Mora. She had testified that Lydia had been caught in Martin's study the night she disappeared, rifling through drawers, that she had threatened to reveal the truth, but her exact words were never recorded, just paraphrased, interpreted. A name emerged from the old report, someone who had been close to both Martin and Lydia, his cousin, Annabel Fielding. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. Annabel Fielding had lived on the estate in the summers, same age as Lydia. They were said to be friends, but after the girl vanished, Annabel had been whisked away to Switzerland for schooling, and her name was absent from any of the official records thereafter. Craddock tracked her down through the Fielding family trust. Now married, Annabel Harrow, she lived just 2 towns over, quietly, on her late husband's estate. They paid her a visit that afternoon. Annabel Harrow was composed, precise, and impeccably dressed. Her house smelled faintly of jasmine and old money. She welcomed them politely but coolly. "I've told all I know," she said once they were seated. "Lydia and I were close once, but we grew apart. She had ambitions. Martin was careless with her. It was a tragedy, but I had no part in it." "Do you know where she is now?" Craddock asked. A flicker of something passed across her face. Too fast to be certainty. "Dead, I presume. Isn't that what everyone believes? And if she wasn't?" Another flicker. "Then I hope she's made peace with it. We were all children then." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Children can be cruel." Annabel met her gaze. "And so can guilt. Martin's was always acute." As they stood to leave, Miss Marple paused near the desk in the drawing-room. A pen rested in a silver holder beside a pad of writing paper. The last letter written was half torn, but she could see the slant of the script, elegant, sharp, a mirror of the envelope Beryl had recalled. "Do you still keep in touch with the family?" Miss Marple asked, voice light. Annabel smiled. "Not since the will was settled. Martin left nothing to anyone, did he? No wonder some feel cheated." It was a clumsy line for a woman so carefully composed. Too deliberate. Back in the car, Craddock turned to her. "You think it was her?" "I think she feared Lydia would talk, and she knew Martin wouldn't stop her. But more than that." Miss Marple's voice grew quiet. "I think Annabel loved Martin. Once. And when Lydia came between them, she didn't just disappear. She was made to. The motive was not one thing, it was many. Guilt in Martin. Vengeance, perhaps, in Lydia. But jealousy. Jealousy had been the spark. The journal wasn't written by Martin. It was curated, assembled, maybe even rewritten. A confession with just enough truth to shift the blame. But to whom? That night Miss Marple read the journal again, this time with new eyes. It wasn't a man unburdening himself. It was someone constructing a story, one that would lead only so far before doubling back. And the locket, hidden in the garden, had not been dropped by accident. It was left there, as a message, or a warning. In the margin of the final page, in ink, faint and slanted differently from the rest, a single line had been added. What was taken must be returned. Miss Marple read it twice. Someone had taken more than Lydia's reputation. They had taken her voice, her future, and now, perhaps fearing exposure, they were tying off loose ends. The web was nearly spun. But the spider, Miss Marple felt, was watching from somewhere nearby. And soon it would move again. It was 3 days after their visit to Annabel Harrow that Inspector Craddock received the call. A gardener had found a coat tucked beneath an overgrown hedgerow along the old cliff path at Rosemir Hall. Tattered, damp and long forgotten by time, it bore a faded label stitched inside the collar, Lydia Marsh. Craddock summoned Miss Marple and drove back to Cornwall before the soil could settle in their minds. The coat, now sealed in evidence, smelled of salt and damp stone. In the inner pocket, an old brooch lay wrapped in tissue, ornate, delicate, and unmistakably Fielding family silver. "To be hidden like this, it suggests guilt," Craddock said as they stood by the evidence table. "If Lydia took it before running away, if she was blackmailing the family, this might have been the final push. The thing that drove Martin or someone else to silence her." Miss Marple said nothing at first. She turned the brooch over, her gloved fingers gentle but precise. "It's not hers," she murmured eventually. "This brooch belonged to Lady Fielding. I saw it once in a wedding announcement years ago. The clasp was distinctive, a tiny sapphire on the catch. Craddock nodded. So Lydia steals a brooch, threatens exposure, and disappears. All very neat. Too neat, she said softly. And the coat, it was hidden but left where someone would find it eventually. Why now? Craddock hesitated. Could be soil erosion, recent rains. Or someone needed a distraction. She placed the brooch down gently. The coat tells the right story. Lydia, a thief, a liar. The brooch confirms it. Convenient, don't you think? Still, the discovery caused a stir. By the end of the week, the local papers had published the headline, "New evidence confirms Lydia Marsh stole from Fielding's before disappearance." The insinuation was loud enough. The village, long quiet with whispers, now spoke openly of closure. The girl had done wrong. The man had suffered. End of story. Craddock felt the pressure mounting. His superiors were pleased. There were quiet discussions of issuing a formal statement of resolution. The journal would remain sealed. The coat would speak louder. Lydia, wherever she was, had either died by her own hand or vanished from shame. But Miss Marple watched the wind move through the trees outside Windmere Cottage and knew the story had begun to fold in on itself. It was late in the afternoon when the next unexpected visitor arrived. A boy, no older than 17, knocking timidly at the gate. He asked for Miss Marple, clutching a worn leather satchel and wearing the wide-eyed look of someone who'd wandered too far into grown-up matters. "I'm Sam," he said, offering her a sheepish smile. Sam Grafton, Ellen's nephew. They sat together in the garden, the air crisp and quiet. The boy opened his bag and pulled out a stack of pages, letters, most of them yellowed and delicate with age. "She never told me about Lydia," he began, eyes lowered. "But when she got sick last winter, I started helping her with things around the hall. That's when I found these in a box in the attic. I think she meant to burn them." Miss Marple took the letters gently. The handwriting was elegant, sharp, familiar. Annabel. She read carefully. Most of the letters were to Martin, dated before and after Lydia's disappearance, and they were full of vitriol, jealousy masked as concern. "She isn't like us, Martin. She won't let go. You must see that. If you don't put an end to it, someone else will." But one letter, undated, folded differently, was written in a messier hand. The ink smudged. "I didn't mean to push her. I only wanted to scare her. She was screaming. Then the rocks. Oh God, the blood. Please don't tell anyone. If you love me, you'll help me fix this." The signature at the bottom was barely legible, but Miss Marple had seen that curled A before. Annabel hadn't only orchestrated a false narrative. She had confessed at least once, and Martin had kept the letter. Why hadn't he used it? Because he loved her. Because, like so many, he had mistaken love for duty and buried the truth alongside Lydia's memory. Miss Marple returned to Craddock that evening, her expression unreadable. She handed him the letters. He read them all, slowly, lips thinning with each page. "This is enough," he said. "It ties her to Lydia's disappearance. She confessed. She lied to us. She forged the journal, or parts of it. We can bring her in." Miss Marple shook her head. "Not yet. There's more to unravel." He looked at her, incredulous. "What more do we need?" "She's scared," Miss Marple replied quietly. "Someone frightened her. Think of the timing. She planted the coat, the brooch, tried to control the story again. But why now? After all these years, Craddock frowned. She thought Lydia was still alive, or knew it. But Lydia would have come forward if she had the proof. Miss Marple's eyes turned distant, unless someone else got to her first. They returned to Annabel's estate early the next morning, only to be told she had left. The housekeeper claimed she'd gone to London for a funeral. Miss Marple, however, spotted the suitcases missing from the vestibule and the mail left unopened. They drove back in silence. At Windmere, a single envelope was waiting by the gate. Addressed to Miss Marple in a rushed, cramped script, no return address. Inside was a note, short and shaking. I made a mistake. I thought she was gone, but someone else was watching her, even after Martin died. I can't sleep. I can't run fast enough. Please stop looking, it's not just me anymore. No signature. Craddock exhaled, grim. She's trying to disappear. Miss Marple stared at the note, her jaw tightening. No, she whispered. She's been warned. Everything pointed to Annabel. The journal, the planted evidence, the letters. But someone else was working, in the background. Someone who had watched Lydia, watched Martin, and was now watching Annabel. Perhaps someone who knew that if the truth came to light, their own secrets would unravel alongside hers. The false victory had drawn a curtain, given the public its tidy conclusion, but behind it, something still moved. And Miss Marple, ever, still in the face of storm, saw now that the end would not come with a scream or a confession. It would come quietly, with one final lie. And then, the truth. It was nearing dusk when Miss Marple stood again at the overgrown gate of Rosemir Hall. The air carried that melancholy hush peculiar to old estates, where silence had grown like ivy over long-forgotten deeds. Craddock, reluctant, but ever deferent, waited by the gravel path while she surveyed the grounds with narrowed eyes. The letter left at Windmere had done more than rattle Annabel. It had awakened something older, something deeper, and Miss Marple had a gnawing feeling that the rot had begun far before Lydia ever stepped foot in Rosemir Hall. The present was merely the last act of a much longer play. She passed under a low arch, trailing her hand along the weather-worn stone, and paused near a set of cracked benches that once overlooked the sea. Here, the landscape had shifted. The cliff's edge was further back than it had been 30 years ago. The ground beneath it unstable, like time itself, was eroding. The land's ability to hold secrets. This is where she would have fallen, Craddock said quietly, joining her, if it happened the way they claimed. Miss Marple didn't answer. Instead, her gaze fixed on the path that led toward the old chapel ruins. She had walked it before, but now, with the fog of recent events swirling behind her, the outline of something older began to form. "Do you know," she said after a moment, "there was a case years ago in Shropshire. A woman, companion to an aging heiress, disappeared under mysterious circumstances. No body was ever found, but the pattern was the same. A diary was discovered afterward claiming instability, threats, and a suicide. The family grieved publicly and quietly locked away the past." Craddock furrowed his brow. "And you think it's connected?" "I think these things rarely happen in isolation, and I remember a name from that case. Dench." His eyes widened slightly. "The housekeeper at Rosemir during Lydia's time?" "Mora Dench. She disappeared shortly after the investigation concluded. But she wasn't just a bystander, Charles. She had a sister, Constance Dench, who was involved in the Shropshire affair. They both served wealthy households. Both reported final warnings about young women who ended up vanishing. Craddock muttered a curse under his breath. "You're saying this could be a pattern. I'm saying it is a pattern. Carefully staged tragedies, women made to seem unstable, conveniently silenced just when they threaten something." She looked out to sea. And always someone nearby to tell just enough of the wrong story. They returned to the village that night, Craddock ordering a search into Mora Dench's whereabouts. But Miss Marple, ever drawn to the overlooked, requested something smaller from the archives, the guest logs and estate records from Rosemir Hall in the year prior to Lydia's disappearance. It took a day for them to arrive, and another for Miss Marple to sift through them. Most names were familiar: distant Fielding relatives, local dignitaries, the occasional artist or composer invited for ambience. But one entry made her stop cold: a Mr. and Mrs. Harrow, guests for a summer week, the same surname Annabel would one day marry into. Craddock blinked. "You think Annabel and her future husband met before all this?" "I think they met here, yes, and I think they were more than visitors." There's a note scrawled beside their entry. Chapel photographs arranged. Harrow bringing camera. He was documenting something, perhaps more than just ruins. "What do you think he saw?" "I think," Miss Marple said slowly, "he saw Lydia, and I think he saw what happened to her." It took some convincing, but with enough leverage from Scotland Yard, Craddock acquired a box from the Harrow estate archives, photographs taken by Frederick Harrow during the summer of 1992. Most were mundane: trees, architectural studies, formal portraits. But near the bottom, buried beneath curling negatives and notes, was a contact sheet of the chapel ruins. And in the far right frame, barely caught in profile, stood two figures. One was unmistakably Martin Fielding. The other, slender and turned away, bore Lydia's dark curls and slight frame. But a third person was there too, half in shadow. A woman watching them from behind a pillar. Annabel. Craddock let out a long breath. So she saw them. She followed them. Miss Marple nodded, and she likely saw their meeting as betrayal. They weren't supposed to see each other. Not privately, not after what the family had done to Lydia's name. But he loved her, even then. The photo dated just 5 days before Lydia disappeared. A visit to the chapel ruins confirmed it. The pillar Annabel had stood behind was hollowed at its base, once used to store altar cloths. In it they found a rusted tin. Inside, dry and brittle but preserved, were pages. Not journal entries, letters. They were from Lydia to Martin. Some were love letters. Others, darker. Fragmented entries filled with fear, of someone watching. Of lies she'd discovered in the Fielding family's books. Of an accusation she planned to make, publicly. She was going to expose something, Craddock said quietly, reading the lines aloud. "He says he'll ruin me if I speak. He says my past will come out. But I won't be quiet. Not this time." Another piece of the puzzle slid into place. Lydia hadn't been silenced because of love. She had discovered something, perhaps financial, perhaps personal, that threatened not just Martin, but the Fielding legacy. And someone had decided that was too dangerous to allow. A name surfaced again and again in her letters: the Dench sisters. "I think Lydia learned what Mora had done before," Miss Marple said. She recognized the pattern, maybe even confronted her. And Mora silenced her, Craddock said grimly. Or helped someone else do it, Miss Marple corrected. Because this wasn't just about hiding Lydia's disappearance. It was about rewriting her into a villain. Craddock closed the tin slowly. We'll need to find Mora, now more than ever. But even as he said it, Miss Marple felt the noose tightening, not around Mora Dench, but around someone who had lived in the shadows all along, manipulating stories, crafting truths, and burying lies. Not just once. The crimes hadn't started with Lydia. They had started long before, woven into the legacy of the Fieldings and those who had everything to lose by letting the past rise. And now, with one final letter, one final photograph, and one missing woman whose silence had lasted far too long, the past was beginning to speak. The following morning brought a veil of pale fog over the village, and the air hung thick with a strange kind of anticipation, one Miss Marple had always associated with the final turns of a mystery, when things once elusive began to shift, quietly, into the light. She sat in the small parlour at Windmere Cottage, the fireplace flickering low. In her lap was a tea tray, and before her, arranged with peculiar precision, were the photographs, especially the one with the shadowed chapel and the faint outline of Annabel, half hidden but present. Craddock had left hours ago to follow the trail of Mora Dench, but Miss Marple had stayed behind, not from fatigue but for strategy. There was still something to be drawn from those who had not yet been fully pressed. And she believed she could extract it, not with force, but with craft. At 10:30 she sent a note by bicycle to the hall, addressed to Annabel. Though Miss Harrow was supposedly out of town, Miss Marple suspected otherwise. The letter was brief and unassuming, requesting tea and conversation. An old woman's curiosity, she wrote, and a longing to clear up one last inconsistency. She dressed carefully, selecting her thickest wool cardigan, the one with slightly fraying cuffs and a wide-brimmed hat that lent her the air of someone entirely unthreatening. By noon she arrived at the hall, where Annabel, paler than usual and with a strain tightening her features, was waiting at the drawing-room door. "You received my note?" Miss Marple said gently. Annabel nodded stiffly. "I wasn't sure I ought to answer it, but I don't like things hanging in the air." Miss Marple smiled kindly. "Oh, nor do I. Loose threads tend to trip us, don't they?" They took tea by the window overlooking the gardens. Annabel poured with practiced grace, but Miss Marple noted how her fingers trembled slightly on the handle, how her gaze flickered often toward the hallway, as though she feared being overheard. There was something haunted about her now, not merely guilt, but fear. "I wanted to ask you something quite trifling," Miss Marple began. "About that summer, Lydia disappeared. You said she was unstable, angry, threatening the family. But I've always wondered, who was the letter for?" Annabel blinked. "The letter?" "The one left in the chapel tin," Miss Marple said casually, though she watched Annabel's eyes closely. "The one begging for help. Don't tell anyone. If you love me, you'll help me fix this. You see, it was unsigned, and while everyone assumed it was written to Martin, I suspect it wasn't." Annabel's teacup clinked softly as she set it down. "I don't know what you're suggesting." "Only that perhaps someone else was involved. Someone Lydia feared more than Martin. Someone she once trusted, Annabel said nothing, but her hand moved almost unconsciously to her necklace, a delicate chain she'd worn each time Miss Marple had seen her. This time there was no pendant. The chain was broken. "Did it snap recently?" Miss Marple asked, nodding toward it. Annabel looked down. "Yes, last week." "What a pity," Miss Marple said, sipping. "You know, that same design, those small twisted links, was popular in the early 90s. Lydia wore one just like it in a photo we recovered, the one Frederick took near the chapel." Annabel's spine straightened subtly, almost imperceptibly, but her expression remained neutral. "You must have been fond of that summer," Miss Marple went on. "Such a romantic time. Long walks, secrets shared. Of course, it must have. Been awkward too, with Martin and Lydia so often. Close." Annabel's lips parted slightly, then closed again. The silence stretched. "It's always difficult when one's affections are misdirected," Miss Marple added, her voice soft, barely above the wind that brushed the windows. "Unrequited love can leave such sharp wounds." "I don't know what you mean." "Oh, I think you do." Miss Marple placed her teacup down carefully. "You loved Lydia, didn't you, Annabel?" It was not a question, and for the first time, Annabel's carefully maintained composure cracked, not dramatically, not even visibly to the untrained eye. But her breath hitched, her eyes shone too quickly, and when she spoke, it was with a brittle calm. She didn't see me that way." "No," Miss Marple said gently, "but she knew, and perhaps others began to suspect. That can be very dangerous, can't it? Especially in a household where appearances are everything." Annabel didn't deny it. She looked out the window, voice low. "It wasn't like that. I never meant for anything to happen. But it did. And when Lydia threatened to expose something, whatever it was she found, you realized she might also expose you, not just your feelings, but how you had watched, followed, interfered." Annabel shook her head slowly. "I tried to protect her." "Did you?" The silence that followed was long and jagged. At last, Annabel said, "I didn't kill her. I swear to you. I never laid a hand on her. Miss Marple believed her." And yet, Annabel's silence in the aftermath had been equally devastating. Protecting her family, protecting herself, leaving Lydia to vanish into rumor and shame. Miss Marple rose slowly. "Sometimes, Annabel, the harm we allow is worse than the harm we cause. Because we know better. And still, we choose silence." As she turned to go, a voice called faintly from the hall. A man's voice. "Belle? Is someone here?" Annabel froze. Her eyes darted to the door. "You should go." Miss Marple hesitated, then leaned in just slightly. "One more thing. The brooch that turned up with Lydia's coat. It was registered as stolen, yes, but not by Lydia. It was reported missing years before she came to Rosemir. Who had access to the family heirlooms then?" Annabel didn't answer. Outside, the fog had begun to lift. Craddock met her at the edge of the garden, his coat damp from sea spray. "We found Mora Dench," he said. "She's living in Devon under the name Mary Denton. Hasn't left her cottage in years." "Did she talk?" "Not yet." He glanced back toward the hall. "But I think someone else is ready to." Miss Marple looked up at the turrets of Rosemir. "She's afraid. Not just of what she did, but of what she allowed. And someone very close, has been using that fear to stay hidden." Craddock nodded toward her hands. "You got something." "A crack," Miss Marple said softly. "A very important crack." and with that, the fog peeled away just enough to see the shape of the truth waiting quietly in the clearing air. Miss Marple had not expected the breakthrough to come so swiftly, nor had she expected it to feel so fragile. It was an odd sensation, like holding a bird in one's hands, knowing the fragile weight of it might slip away at any moment. Craddock had left early that morning to meet with the local authorities, following up on a tip that Mora Dench, under the alias Mary Denton, might be closer to revealing the truth than anyone had anticipated. Meanwhile, Miss Marple stayed at Rosemir, drawn to the stillness of the hall's grandiose halls, where the echo of their conversations seemed to grow louder with every passing hour. She had a keen sense that the final pieces were almost within reach until, that is, they weren't. It happened in the late afternoon. She had just returned from the garden after making another attempt to speak with Annabel, who had been uncharacteristically silent since their last conversation. As Miss Marple entered the study, she froze. The room was disordered in a way it had not been before. Papers, once neatly arranged, were now scattered across the desk. Drawers stood ajar, and the file containing the photographs of Lydia, those critical photos showing her with Martin and Annabel, was gone. She moved to the desk, her fingers lightly brushing the surface. It was subtle, this disruption. It was the sort of thing that would go unnoticed by anyone else, except that Miss Marple had grown intimately familiar with the placement of every item in this room. Someone had been here. Someone who knew exactly what they were looking for. She moved quickly, retracing the steps she'd taken upon first entering the room. The other files were undisturbed, but the one she sought was gone. The photographs had vanished, as had the tin containing Lydia's letters. For a moment, Miss Marple stood utterly still, listening for the sound of footsteps in the hall, the creak of a door. But there was nothing. Only the distant murmur of the sea beyond the estate walls. It wasn't until Craddock returned that evening, looking more tired than usual, that she spoke. She had waited for him to settle into his chair to offer her the usual details of his day before dropping the bombshell. "There's something missing," she said, her voice calm, as though the discovery were not nearly as urgent as it truly was. Craddock's brows furrowed. "Missing?" "The photographs, the letters, the file I'd assembled here. Gone." His eyes narrowed. "But it was here, in this room?" "Quite so. I was certain of it." He stood immediately, his hand gripping the back of his chair as though trying to steady himself. "That's impossible. The staff doesn't come into this room, you're sure?" Miss Marple nodded slowly. "Someone with knowledge of the investigation, someone who knew exactly what I was looking at, has been here." "Who?" he demanded. She thought for a moment before answering. "Annabel." Craddock's face shifted, conflicted. "She didn't strike me as someone capable of—" "I didn't say it was her," Miss Marple interrupted gently. "But I do believe she knows more than she's letting on. And she may very well be hiding something, perhaps without even realizing the full weight of it. The photographs and letters were key pieces of evidence. We must assume someone wants to prevent us from seeing them." The implications were chilling. If the evidence had been removed, or worse, destroyed, it meant they were not merely facing a crime of passion or jealousy. Someone had been working against them, systematically erasing the truth before it could be revealed. "I'll get the police involved," Craddock said, his voice suddenly sharp. "We'll search the whole estate." "No," Miss Marple replied firmly, "not yet." "Not yet?" His confusion deepened. "Why?" Miss Marple's gaze settled on the window overlooking the sea. The waves crashed against the rocks below, distant and indifferent. Because, Charles, the disappearance of the evidence is no accident. Whoever did this is much closer than we realize. They're watching, and they know exactly how far we've come. But if they're so close, why leave any traces at all? Craddock asked, perplexed. Because they believe we've missed something they haven't anticipated. She paused, then added, and I'm inclined to agree. Craddock's brow furrowed further. What do you mean? I believe the thief, the one who took the evidence. They made a mistake. Mistake? Yes. Think, Charles. Whoever removed that file would not have expected the photographs to be the ones I would focus on. They assumed the other clues, the ones about the Dench sisters, perhaps, were what mattered. The photographs were intended to be a distraction, but in taking them, they have confirmed something they should have left alone. Confirmed what? That we are on the right path. They took the photographs, but they did not take the letters. The letters remain. That is the next step. Whoever has those photographs believes the truth lies in their absence. They are wrong. Craddock, though skeptical, followed her gaze back to the sea, then nodded reluctantly. What do you want to do? We need to act quickly before whoever is hiding their tracks can make another move. Craddock left again, this time with a clearer directive. Miss Marple remained in the study, pondering the scene before her. If the photographs had been the distraction, they had still served a critical role. The connection between Martin Fielding, Annabel and Lydia was as clear as ever, but it was the letters that carried the weight, the desperate pleas Lydia had made. Those words might hold the key to not just her death, but to the broader conspiracy that had already claimed so many lives. As night fell, Miss Marple returned to the chapel ruins, the same place where the photographs had been taken. She knew the place well by now. Its solitude had become a strange comfort, a place where secrets whispered in the wind seemed somehow more alive than in the dim halls of Rosemir. It was there, amid the ivy-clad stones, that she found the first clue, the one that revealed just how desperate her adversary had become. Hidden in a small crevice at the foot of the altar, beneath layers of dead leaves, was a scrap of paper. The writing on it was barely legible, but Miss Marple's trained eye recognized the handwriting instantly. Annabel's. And on it, in hurried script, were two words that made Miss Marple's heart lurch in her chest. Find her. It was a plea, and it was a warning, and it made it clear that the race had just begun in earnest. Someone was very close to cracking, and whoever it was desperate to bury the truth before it could be uncovered. But Miss Marple had never been one to back down when the shadows grew deeper. She had always known the key to this puzzle was never just in the present, it was in the past. And now, more than ever, that past was coming back to claim its due. The morning after Miss Marple's discovery in the chapel was crisp and biting. A soft mist hung in the air, clinging to the trees like an omen. She felt the weight of it, the weight of everything, bearing down on her. What had seemed like an unraveling mystery was now beginning to twist back upon itself, forming new knots. Whoever had removed the photographs from the study had made a critical mistake in leaving behind that single telling piece of paper. But what would come next? What would they do to keep the past buried? By the time Craddock returned from his inquiries in the village, Miss Marple had already gathered a number of thoughts. The evening before, she had sent word for Annabel to meet her, Though she feared Annabel's motives might be darker than even she had imagined, Miss Marple still believed there was more to learn from the girl. The letters, the plea. Find her. But when Craddock entered the sitting room at Rosemir, his face was pale, drawn. He didn't even need to speak for Miss Marple to sense that something had gone terribly wrong. "Craddock?" she asked, her voice steady despite the growing knot in her stomach. He shook his head, his jaw clenched. "There's been another murder." The words landed with the force of a thunderclap. For a moment the room felt suffocating, the air thick and unbreathable. "Another one?" she asked, rising slowly from her chair. "Who?" "Mora Dench," Craddock replied. "She was found just this morning at her cottage in Devon, slashed quite violently. No signs of forced entry, but we believe it's connected." Miss Marple's heart sank. Mora Dench, the very woman who had been hiding in the shadows of their investigation, the very woman who had been, in some twisted way, tied to the dark. Past that seemed to loom over Windmere Cottage. "We're certain it's connected?" Miss Marple asked, even as a cold knot of dread formed in her chest. The method, similar to Lydia's. The patterns too close. "But there's more," Craddock said, his voice dropping. "She was holding something when she died." "What?" "A photograph." Miss Marple's breath caught. It was the last thing she had expected to hear. She had assumed that the key to everything, the thread that would unravel the entire case, was the set of photographs, those now stolen from her study. But this felt like a message, a deliberate continuation of something far darker. A photograph of Lydia. Craddock continued. "We haven't been able to recover it. It's gone, taken perhaps. But the angle of the wound, it looks deliberate. Whoever did this didn't just kill her. They wanted to make sure the photograph disappeared. Then, they're still after something," Miss Marple murmured. "Something we've yet to fully understand." "We don't have much time," Craddock said urgently. "The autopsy report's on the way. But I've already sent someone to search her cottage. We need to know what she was hiding, what connection she had to Lydia." Miss Marple thought for a moment. "Have you checked the phone records? Who was Mora in contact with recently?" Craddock paused. "We were about to. Why?" Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. "She might have been trying to warn someone or trying to reach out. Whoever killed her didn't just do it because of something in the present. They did it to protect something far older." Before Craddock could reply, the phone rang, the shrill sound cutting through the quiet of the room like an alarm. Miss Marple felt a surge of unease. She watched Craddock answer, his voice tense as he listened to the news from the other end. When he hung up, his expression had gone cold. "Annabel," he said simply. Miss Marple's heart skipped a beat. "What about her?" "She's gone," Craddock replied. "Disappeared. Vanished." "What?" Miss Marple took a step forward. "But she was here just yesterday. She agreed to meet with me this morning." "I don't know," Craddock said, rubbing his forehead in frustration. "Her room's empty, and no one saw her leave. Her things are gone. It's like she vanished into thin air." Miss Marple's mind raced. Annabel was already tangled in this web, and now, with Mora's death, the whole situation had spiraled into something even more dangerous. Someone was playing a game far beyond what they had originally thought. And Annabel, fragile and unpredictable, had somehow become the center of it all. "We need to find her," Miss Marple said, her voice low. "We need to understand what she's hiding, or else it will all be for nothing." "We're doing everything we can," Craddock insisted, though his words were hollow. But this is getting worse by the minute. Whoever's behind this, they know we're closing in." "I know," Miss Marple replied, her gaze far away, "which is why they're so desperate to erase the truth." They left Rosemir and drove to Devon, where Mora Dench's cottage stood, nestled in the coastal hills. The village was quiet, too quiet for Miss Marple's liking. As they approached the cottage, Craddock's voice broke the stillness. They found her body inside, slumped against the door. No signs of a struggle, though it was obvious the attack came from behind. She never even had a chance. "Do we know if she was alone?" Miss Marple asked as they parked near the small stone building. "They're looking into it, but no one saw anything strange. The neighbors said she kept to herself." Inside, the small, cluttered cottage felt suffocating. The air was thick with the scent of must and old paper. Mora's belongings were strewn about in a haphazard fashion, but Miss Marple's eyes were immediately drawn to the small table in the corner where a vase had been knocked over, its contents spilled across the floor, and then, amidst the chaos, she spotted it. A book lying open on the floor, its pages half-turned. The title, barely visible, was The Family of Shadows. "I believe we've just found the next clue," Miss Marple said softly. The title alone told her enough. It was a history book, a family history to be precise, a history that no one had wanted to uncover, a history that had now claimed its second victim. As Craddock reached for the book, his eyes narrowed. "What do you think this is about?" Miss Marple's eyes softened. "Everything we've uncovered so far, the photographs, the letters, the whispers about Lydia, they were all part of a much larger secret, and now someone is willing to kill to keep it buried." A cold wind howled through the cottage, carrying with it the unmistakable scent of something even darker on the horizon. The hours stretched thin as Craddock and Miss Marple combed through the cottage. Every inch of Mora Dench's life was now laid bare before them. Her journals, old letters, books on local history, and photographs that seemed to hold no immediate meaning. It all felt like a puzzle without a clear image, the pieces scattered and jagged with no place to fit. Yet beneath the surface, Miss Marple could sense that something was beginning to crystallize, like a shadow slowly taking shape in the gloom. As they moved through the small sitting room, Craddock came across a small, hand-carved box tucked away on the shelf near the hearth. It was peculiar, its design rough yet intricate, something personal, something more than just a trinket. He lifted the lid, revealing a handful of items, but it was a single faded letter tucked beneath them that caught his attention. The paper was yellowed with age, the ink smudged in places, as though it had been handled many times over the years. Craddock held it out to Miss Marple, and she took it, her fingers tracing the worn edges. The letter, though difficult to read, was signed by a name Miss Marple recognized: Martin Fielding. "I've seen this before," she murmured under her breath, her mind working swiftly. The handwriting, the name, it all felt connected, a thread she had yet to pull loose. But before she could delve further into her thoughts, Craddock's voice broke through the quiet. "Miss Marple, look at this." His tone was tight with urgency, and Miss Marple turned to see him holding something else, a small piece of cloth, frayed at the edges, but unmistakable in its design. It was part of a woman's dress. Miss Marple took the fabric, running it through her fingers. The pattern was delicate, nothing extravagant, but refined in its simplicity. She held it up to the light, studying it carefully. There was something familiar about it, something that tugged at her memory. "That's from Lydia," she said, the realization coming with startling clarity. "This is from the same fabric she wore in that portrait, the one you showed me." Craddock's eyes widened. "So this was with Mora, the same woman?" "Not just any woman, Miss Marple," replied, her voice steady. "This is the link that has been hiding in plain sight. Martin Fielding, Annabel, Mora Dench. They were all connected through Lydia. But it wasn't just one woman's disappearance that tied them together. It was a web, a family secret that none of them wanted to reveal. But why hide it?" Craddock asked, his brow furrowed in confusion. "Because it wasn't just about Lydia," Miss Marple said softly. "It was about a family legacy, one that someone was willing to kill to keep buried." They moved back to the cottage's small writing desk, where Miss Marple began carefully sifting through the papers. It wasn't long before she found it, the missing piece, the one thing that had been eluding her understanding of the case. A letter, written in Lydia's unmistakable handwriting, addressed to someone only identified as A. Miss Marple read the letter aloud, her voice a whisper in the dim room. "I can't do this anymore. I know what you've been hiding. I know what happened all those years ago, and I can't pretend it didn't happen. But I won't be silent, and I won't let you ruin me. If I disappear, you'll be the one they look at. I've kept your secret long enough. Lydia." Craddock's face grew pale as he took in the words. She knew. She was going to expose it. Miss Marple nodded slowly. "Yes. And whoever is behind this, whoever has been trying to bury Lydia's past, realized that she was close to revealing everything. The key wasn't just in her death, it was in what she was about to do." They stood in the quiet, the weight of the revelation hanging heavily between them. It was clear now that Lydia's death wasn't just a tragic end, it was the beginning of something far more sinister, a game that was still being played out. The murder of Mora Dench, the sudden disappearance of Annabel, it was all part of a carefully orchestrated plan to prevent the truth from ever coming to light. But the pattern was emerging now, slow and deliberate. The connections between the people involved were beginning to solidify, and Miss Marple could see the outlines of the story that had been buried in the past. The woman who had died, the woman who had written that final letter, Lydia, wasn't just a casualty of circumstance. She had been a victim of something far more calculated, and whoever had been involved in this dark web of deception was still out there, hiding in the shadows. Miss Marple's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of Craddock's voice. "So we're looking for a family secret. But what is it? What's the link between Lydia, Martin Fielding, and Mora Dench?" Miss Marple paused, thinking deeply. "I don't know yet, but I have an inkling. There's a pattern to the way these people have been hiding the truth. They're not just connected by chance. They're connected by a shared history, a legacy that they thought they could bury." As the pieces fell into place, Miss Marple felt the gravity of it all. It wasn't just about solving a murder anymore, it was about preventing more deaths. Someone was playing a game, one that stretched back generations. And if Miss Marple didn't uncover the truth soon, there would be more casualties, more people who would be silenced to protect a past that no one wanted exposed. But she had no intention of letting that happen. Not when the pieces of the puzzle were finally within reach. As they left the cottage, Miss Marple's mind was already racing ahead. Annabel was still out there, and with every passing minute, the threat to her safety grew stronger. Whoever was orchestrating these crimes was willing to kill to protect their secret. But Miss Marple had learned one thing about people like that. they always made mistakes. And that mistake, that small crack in their carefully constructed facade, was what she was determined to find. "Let's go," she said to Craddock, her voice sharp with resolve. "We have no time to lose." Miss Marple's mind raced as she and Craddock made their way to the nearby village of Devon, where Annabel's last known whereabouts had been traced. The fabric of the case was tightening around her. But with every new revelation, the web only seemed to become more tangled. The letter from Lydia, the photograph, the connections to Martin Fielding and Mora Dench. It was all coming together in a way that made her feel a growing sense of urgency. Annabel was out there slipping through their fingers, but Miss Marple was no longer concerned with merely finding her. Now she was determined to uncover the full extent of the game being played. As they arrived at the small cottage where Annabel had been staying, Miss Marple's intuition told her they were nearing the end of something. The air felt thick with it, like the calm before a storm. The house, now silent and abandoned, seemed to hold its breath. Craddock stood by the door, turning the key with a measured hand. "We have to move fast," he muttered, his voice taut with anxiety. "Whoever's behind this is dangerous." Miss Marple nodded, but didn't respond. The puzzle pieces had finally started to fit together in a way that felt eerily deliberate, each step taken with a purpose that was far too calculated to be mere coincidence. She had already suspected there was something more to the crime than just simple revenge or financial gain, but the full picture was only now beginning to reveal itself. Inside, the cottage was barren, its furnishings sparse and utilitarian. There was nothing in the place that spoke of Annabel's presence, no personal mementos, no indication of her thoughts or habits, as though she had never truly settled here. But then, Miss Marple's eyes fell upon something on the floor. It was a small, frayed letter, almost hidden beneath a dusty table leg. "Craddock, look at this," Miss Marple said quietly. He hurried over and bent down to pick it up. The handwriting was familiar. It matched the letters she had seen before, but the words written inside were chilling. "I can't keep running. I thought I could, but I can't. You were right all along, and now I know what I have to do. It's not just about the past anymore, it's about the future. I'm sorry, I have to finish it. Annabel." The letter felt like a confession, an admission of guilt, perhaps, or a final statement. But something in Miss Marple's mind clicked as she read it. It wasn't just guilt she was reading. It was fear. Fear of something larger than herself, something beyond her control. And now the stakes had changed once more. Annabel had known more than she had let on, and now she had chosen to act in a way that Miss Marple hadn't anticipated. "The future," Miss Marple whispered. She paused, her thoughts racing. The future? What could she have meant by that? Craddock was already looking at her, his expression intense. "Are you saying she was involved in all of this? That she's been playing a part in these murders?" "No," Miss Marple replied quickly. "But she's been manipulated, just as much as the rest of them. Whoever's behind this has made sure that she believes she's doing the right thing." She stood up and began to pace slowly around the room, her mind sifting through the pieces like a masterful chess player analyzing the board. There was something about Annabel's final words that triggered a deeper understanding. The murders were no longer just about the people involved. They were about the legacy, the idea of legacy, and how it shaped the decisions of those caught in its grip. "Craddock," Miss Marple said abruptly, "I believe I now understand what's happening here." He looked at her, waiting for her to continue. The deaths were never about money or power, as we first assumed. It's something deeper, something psychological, she explained. Someone has been using these people's pasts to control them. Mora Dench, Martin Fielding, Lydia, they all had a connection to a shared history, but there's one person pulling the strings, one person who, until now, we've overlooked. Their psychology, Craddock said slowly, his brow furrowed. But who? Who's been behind all of this? Miss Marple's gaze was distant. It's not just one person. It's a family. A legacy of manipulation that has been passed down through generations. Craddock's confusion deepened. A family? You mean... Martin Fielding, she interrupted, her voice firm now. He was the key all along. His role was never just to hide the truth. It was to control the narrative, to ensure that the family's secret would remain sealed. But it wasn't just Lydia or Annabel he was trying to protect. It was something far deeper than that. A dark history that goes beyond money, beyond revenge. This has always been about a person's need to feel in control of their own legacy. Miss Marple took a breath, feeling the weight of the truth pressing down on her chest. You see, Martin, Fielding isn't just a man with a secret. He's a man who believes that his family's history, its legacy, is worth any price. He doesn't care about the murders. He doesn't care about the bodies. He cares about the power to shape the story. Craddock's face was a mixture of realization and disbelief. So it wasn't just about the past. It was about controlling the future, about ensuring that no one could expose the truth. Yes, Miss Marple nodded. Martin Fielding believed that by eliminating anyone who could reveal the family secret, he could reshape the future. He could protect his legacy and keep his version of history intact. It's not greed or revenge that's driving him. It's fear, the fear of losing control. Craddock was silent for a moment as he absorbed the weight of what Miss Marple had just said. It was a theory he hadn't considered, one that struck at the very core of the case. The motives behind the murders weren't driven by tangible things. They were driven by something far more abstract, more insidious, a desire for power, a need for control, and in that moment it became painfully clear. This wasn't just a story of a murderer hiding in the shadows. This was the story of a family willing to destroy everything and everyone in their path to maintain the illusion of power, the very same power that had begun to slip from their grasp. We have to find Fielding, Miss Marple said, her voice hardening with resolve. He's the one who can end this. He's the one who's been pulling the strings from the start. As Craddock moved to make the necessary arrangements, Miss Marple felt the last piece of the puzzle slide into place. The truth was ugly, far darker than she had ever expected, but it was the truth. And now it was only a matter of time before she exposed it to the light. The game was coming to an end, and Fielding had no idea what was coming for him. The hours that followed felt like an eternity to Miss Marple. The quiet, tense waiting as Craddock worked to locate Martin Fielding was excruciating. The pieces of the puzzle had fallen into place, but there was still the matter of confronting the man who had orchestrated everything. The man whose fear of losing control had led to a trail of death and deception. They needed him to confess, to admit what he had done. But Miss Marple knew that getting to the truth wasn't going to be easy. Fielding would fight back with everything he had left. The detective sat in the small parlour of the Devon cottage, her mind running through the details, trying to predict every possible move. The telephone beside her had rung a few times, but each call had been inconclusive. The house itself was silent now, as if the walls were holding their breath, waiting for the final showdown. It wasn't until evening that the breakthrough came. Craddock had managed to track down a lead, a whispered rumour from one of Fielding's old colleagues who had been part of a charitable foundation, a cause that Fielding had heavily invested in. The charitable act, of course, was part of his carefully curated image, his legacy that he hoped would ensure the world remembered him with reverence. But there had always been a shadow behind that public persona, a shadow that Miss Marple had been watching closely. "The field is clear," Craddock's voice came from the doorway, cutting through her thoughts. "Fielding is at the estate. We've got him cornered." Miss Marple nodded, standing up and walking toward the window. The estate was situated just beyond the village, surrounded by miles of untouched countryside, a fortress of isolation. If this was where Fielding intended to make his last stand, then they had to be prepared. He had nowhere to run, but that didn't mean he wouldn't fight. "He'll try to escape," Miss Marple murmured. "He always knew the importance of maintaining control. He'll try one last attempt at misdirection, at manipulation. We cannot allow him to have the upper hand." Craddock studied her, his expression resolute. "What do you suggest?" "I'll confront him directly," Miss Marple replied, her voice unwavering. "We've played the game his way for too long. Now we'll make him play by our rules." The trip to the estate felt long, though it was only a short drive from the cottage. Craddock's car cut through the narrow, winding roads of the village, the headlights illuminating patches of trees and brush that swayed in the evening breeze. Miss Marple sat quietly, her thoughts focused, her plan slowly taking shape. By the time they arrived, the estate stood eerily silent, a grand, dilapidated manor that seemed to exude the same air of control that Martin Fielding had tried so hard to maintain in life. The windows were dark, the door slightly ajar, as though it were expecting them. Miss Marple stepped out of the car, her mind calm, but her instincts sharp. This was the moment, the point of no return. Craddock glanced at her with a look of silent question, but she merely nodded. He understood. The two of them approached the front door, and as they crossed the threshold, a slight sound came from the hallway. Footsteps. They were not alone. Miss Marple's eyes scanned the room, her mind absorbing the surroundings with meticulous care. The decor was grand, but it held an air of decay. Dust settled on the furniture, the chandelier hung with cobwebs. The estate had been abandoned in more ways than one, and then, from the shadows, Martin Fielding stepped into view. He looked every bit the part of the man they had all imagined, refined, composed, yet now there was a nervous energy about him. His face was pale, his eyes sharp with a mixture of fear and defiance. He knew why they were here, but he wasn't ready to face the consequences. "So, Miss Marple," he said coolly, his voice carrying a forced calm. "I suppose you've come to pass judgment on me, as you always do." "You know why we're here, Mr. Fielding," Miss Marple replied evenly. "You've been playing a game with all of us, using your family's history as a tool to manipulate others, but it's over now." Fielding's lips curled into a thin smile. "Manipulate? I've simply preserved what was mine to preserve. The past is the past. It's what defines us, gives us our power, our legacy. It's what keeps us in control." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. She could see through the bravado now. He was desperate, cornered, and in that desperation, he would try anything to cling to what he thought he still had. You haven't preserved anything, Mr. Fielding. You've buried it. You've buried people, truths, and lives, Miss Marple said, her tone growing firmer. But what you didn't anticipate was that the truth would rise, no matter how hard you tried to bury it. Fielding took a step forward, his gaze flickering between her and Craddock. I did what was necessary. You don't understand. The family. Everything depended on me. I couldn't let it all fall apart. If it had been exposed, if they knew what we were really capable of, what we really were, then all the years of effort would have been for nothing. Effort to protect a lie, Miss Marple said, her voice now cutting through his justifications. You didn't protect your family. You destroyed it. You destroyed everything that was good in your life by trying to control the narrative. And now it's time to face the consequences. Fielding's face darkened. You think you've won, don't you? You think you've figured it all out. But you're too late. It's already done. Before Miss Marple could respond, Fielding's hand moved quickly to a drawer beside him. Craddock's eyes widened, but Miss Marple's reaction was faster. Without a word, she took a step forward, catching his wrist just as it reached for the revolver hidden inside. She twisted his arm expertly, forcing him to release the weapon with a sharp gasp. Trying to escape with violence, Mr. Fielding? She asked, her tone cool and unflinching. You truly haven't learned a thing. Craddock stepped forward, taking the weapon from the floor, and Miss Marple let go of Fielding's arm. He staggered back, his breath coming in short gasps as his reality began to collapse around him. It's over, Miss Marple said simply. You can't escape what you've done. You can't escape the truth. And soon you'll be judged for all of it. For a moment Fielding stood there defeated, his eyes now haunted by the understanding that he had been outplayed, outthought, and outmaneuvered. There was no more power for him to cling to, no more legacy to protect. The game was finally over. Just. As Miss Marple watched Fielding being handcuffed and led away, she felt the last flicker of satisfaction fade. She knew something wasn't quite right. There was a nagging feeling that refused to dissipate, like a low hum in the background of a symphony just before the final note. Fielding's confession had been far too easy, and despite the dramatic conclusion, Miss Marple couldn't shake the suspicion that this wasn't the full story. The final reveal had seemed inevitable, and yet, deep down, Miss Marple's instincts warned her not to rush to judgment. She'd seen this before. The temptation to believe that the puzzle had been solved, only for a final, unexpected twist to prove otherwise. Craddock turned to her with a weary smile. It's over. We've got him. Yes, she agreed, her voice cool, but her mind still working. We've got him, but I'm not convinced the case is over. Craddock gave her a puzzled look. What do you mean? You see, Craddock, Miss Marple said slowly, we've been given a nice, tidy answer. Fielding wanted to preserve his family legacy, so he killed to cover his tracks. But there's something about the way it all unfolded that doesn't sit right with me. Fielding may have been a participant, but I'm not so sure he was the architect of it all. Craddock raised an eyebrow, not entirely following her reasoning. Then who else could it be? Miss Marple's gaze drifted back to the estate, where shadows now seemed to stretch long across the lawn, like silent witnesses to a tragedy that had yet to fully unfold. Before Craddock could respond, they were interrupted by the sound of a vehicle pulling into the gravel driveway. The headlights illuminated the doorway of the manor, casting eerie light on the otherwise dark surroundings. It was another police car, but this one was different. It had a higher-ranking officer, a man Miss Marple recognized from earlier in the investigation, Chief Inspector Gerald Holmes. Miss Marple, Craddock. Holmes greeted them stiffly, his voice clipped with the edge of someone who had just learned something unsettling. "I need to speak with you." "Is something wrong?" Craddock asked, his tone growing more serious as he noted the inspector's grim expression. Holmes stepped closer, his eyes darting between them. "I've just received new information. Information that changes everything." Miss Marple straightened. "Go on," she urged, her mind already working. Holmes took a breath. "We've been looking at the wrong person. The real mastermind wasn't Martin Fielding at all." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle in the cool air. "It was his daughter, Eleanor Fielding." The revelation hit like a sudden storm. Miss Marple felt the ground shift beneath her, her heart racing as she absorbed the new twist. "Eleanor?" Craddock echoed, his voice incredulous. "But she was the victim. She died in the fire." "That's what we thought," Holmes replied. "But the evidence we've gathered in the last hour suggests otherwise. Eleanor isn't dead. She faked her own death." Miss Marple's mind raced. It made sense, in a twisted way. Eleanor had been the quiet one, the one everyone overlooked. She'd been the one who seemed to disappear into the background while her father became the center of attention. And yet her quiet demeanor had been a clever mask, a cover for something much darker. "But why?" Miss Marple asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why would she do it?" Holmes looked uncomfortable, glancing down at his shoes. "According to the evidence, Eleanor had been in contact with several people in the weeks leading up to her supposed death. She was orchestrating things from the shadows." "And Fielding?" Miss Marple pressed. "He didn't know?" "He knew nothing," Holmes said. "He was just a pawn. Eleanor knew exactly how to manipulate him, how to keep him under control. She used him to get what she wanted, control over the estate and the family fortune." Miss Marple closed her eyes for a moment, piecing together the tangled web of deception. So it was Eleanor all along. She had her father killed, framed it to look like a natural death, and then created this elaborate scheme to make us believe he was the one pulling the strings. Craddock shook his head, still trying to wrap his mind around it. "But why would she kill her father? Wasn't he the one who had the power? Why go through all this trouble just to take his place?" "Because," Miss Marple replied, her voice growing more resolute, "Eleanor wanted more than just power. She wanted to erase the family's past, to reshape the future on her terms. Martin Fielding's legacy was a weight that would always drag her down, a constant reminder of the dark secrets the family carried. By killing him and making it look like he was the villain, she could reinvent herself, become the one who had everything, with no one to question her authority." Holmes stepped forward, his expression grim. "We've already been in contact with Eleanor's associates. They've admitted to helping her fake her death. She's been hiding in plain sight all along. She was here, in the house, just before we arrived. We think she's trying to slip away, but we've got her cornered now." Miss Marple felt a surge of adrenaline. Everything, every piece of the puzzle, was falling into place. Eleanor Fielding had been hiding in plain sight, playing a part in her father's death and in the subsequent investigation, manipulating the story for her own gain. "We need to act quickly," she said, her mind sharp. "She won't go down without a fight. But this time, she won't outsmart us." They moved quickly through the house, their steps deliberate, the tension thick in the air. The estate had become a stage, and Eleanor Fielding was the final player. Miss Marple's heart pounded in her chest as she prepared for the final confrontation. There was no more room for doubt, no more time for second guesses. Eleanor would not escape justice. As they reached the drawing room, a faint rustling noise from behind a set of drapes caught Miss Marple's attention. She gestured for the others to wait. Slowly, deliberately, she moved toward the sound, her steps light, her breath steady. And there she was, Eleanor Fielding, standing in the shadows, a cruel smile tugging at her lips. "So, you finally figured it out," she said, her voice a low, mocking whisper. Miss Marple stepped forward, her eyes cold. "The truth always comes to light, Miss Fielding. And this time, you will not escape." Eleanor's smile faltered, but only for a moment. She glanced toward the window, weighing her options. There was still one last chance for her to run, but she knew it was too late. The game was up. Eleanor stood there, her figure draped in the shadow of the heavy curtains, her eyes flashing with a mixture of defiance and fear. For a moment, no one spoke. Craddock, Holmes, and Miss Marple all stood still, the weight of the moment hanging in the air like a storm about to break. "I should have known," Miss Marple said softly, her voice carrying a note of quiet certainty that seemed to disarm even Eleanor for a second. "You weren't satisfied with your inheritance, were you? You wanted something more, something no one could take away from you. And the only way to get that was to erase the very man who could." "Stand in your way." Eleanor's lips curled into a thin smile. "You think you understand it all, don't you? But you're wrong. It was never about money or revenge. It was about control, about taking back what was rightfully mine all along. My father was the one who trapped me in this family's shadow. I had to free myself. You freed yourself by murdering your father and faking your own death." Craddock's voice was incredulous, disbelief still evident in his eyes. "You still don't get it," Eleanor replied, her voice now cold, almost detached. "I needed to kill him, to erase him from the family's legacy. He was weak, and he was ruining everything I wanted to achieve. If I killed him and staged my death, I could step in as the rightful heir without anyone suspecting a thing. I even planted enough evidence to make it look like it was all his doing." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. She could feel the tension between them, the certainty in Eleanor's words, and yet there was something more, something beneath it all that didn't quite match. "You were clever, Eleanor, very clever, but you weren't careful enough." Eleanor's smile faltered, but she quickly masked it with another wave of confidence. "And what exactly did you think you would find, Miss Marple? You think you've solved this puzzle, but it's too late. You can't stop me now." At that, Miss Marple felt a strange calm settle over her. "You see, Eleanor, it's always the small things that give you away, the details that others overlook, but never me." The sound of a faint rustling from the far corner of the room caught everyone's attention, just as Miss Marple's words sank in. It was the subtle shifting of a chair, something too quiet, yet perfectly timed to send a wave of recognition through her mind. In an instant, Miss Marple moved forward, her eyes fixed on the chair Eleanor had been standing near moments before. Beneath the delicate fabric of a discarded scarf, she spotted the unmistakable glint of something metal. A small silver pin, an accessory that had belonged to Eleanor's father, Martin Fielding. "I should have noticed this sooner," Miss Marple said quietly. reaching down to lift the pin from the chair. "This was what you thought you could use to throw us off the trail. You planted it among the ruins, didn't you, hoping we'd think it belonged to your father? But this pin wasn't lost in the fire. It was deliberately placed here by you, just like everything else." Eleanor's face twisted in frustration as she watched Miss Marple's hands gently turn the pin over. It was a small detail, a seemingly insignificant object, but it was precisely that which had slipped past everyone's notice. The silver pin, once a part of Fielding's collection, had been tucked away in the manor's ruins long after the fire. It wasn't just a clue to the past, it was a message, a subtle hint planted by Eleanor herself. "You didn't expect us to find it here, did you?" Miss Marple continued, her voice cutting through the tension in the room. "You thought that by burning the evidence, we'd be left with nothing to prove your involvement. But I knew that a woman like you would never leave things to chance. You thought you could outsmart us all, Eleanor. You were wrong." Eleanor's expression twisted, and for the first time, a flicker of panic crossed her face. How dare you?" "But there's more," Miss Marple interrupted her, her tone now colder, more deliberate. "The fire wasn't an accident, was it? You staged it. You took great care to make sure that your father's body was destroyed. But your attempt to destroy the truth was foiled by something simple. Your own failure to remove one small detail. This pin, this trivial object." Craddock stepped closer, now piecing together the final parts of the puzzle. "So it was you, all along. You killed your father. You faked your death to cover it up. You manipulated everyone, including us." Eleanor opened her mouth as if to protest, but then closed it again, her shoulders slumping as her bravado crumbled. She had underestimated Miss Marple just as many before her had, and now the truth was undeniable. "I did what I had to do," Eleanor muttered, her voice barely above a whisper. "He was never going to let me be who I was meant to be. It was either him or me." Miss Marple's gaze softened just a fraction. She had heard it before, the justifications, the twisted reasoning. People often believed they had no choice, but the truth was different. There was always another way, even if it didn't seem apparent at the time. As Holmes stepped forward to arrest Eleanor, she made no attempt to resist. Her shoulders sagged as the realization finally hit her. She had been caught. The walls had closed in. But as the officers began to escort Eleanor out of the room, Miss Marple's mind was already working, the pieces of the puzzle slowly shifting into place. The events had unfolded in a way she had not expected, but that was the nature of these cases. The truth was often stranger than fiction, and just when it seemed like justice had been served, the questions remained. Why had Eleanor gone to such extremes? What had truly driven her to betray everything? As the police car carrying Eleanor Fielding pulled away from the estate, Miss Marple stood in silence, staring at the now quiet house. She knew that this chapter had ended, but another, perhaps an even deeper mystery, was waiting just beneath the surface. Justice had been served, yes, but some truths would always linger, like shadows in the corners of a room. And as for the future, Miss Marple knew that the past had a way of following us, no matter how hard we tried to bury it. Her instincts had been right. The case wasn't just about murder, it was about something far darker, the lengths to which a person would go to rewrite history, to escape their past, and to hide their true nature. The night had settled in, a quiet blanket that seemed to weigh down on the sleepy village. The police car had long disappeared, and the estate of Windmere Cottage was once again abandoned, its grand exterior now a hollow monument to the events that had unfolded within its walls. But for Miss Marple, the conclusion of one case was always the beginning of something else. As she walked slowly down the gravel driveway, her thoughts were heavy, but not in the way one might expect after solving such a convoluted puzzle. Craddock had already returned to his office, no doubt preparing a report to close the case, and Holmes had quietly left, his manner still marked by the strain of being outsmarted by an elderly woman. Yet there was something about the way the final pieces had fallen into place that made Miss Marple uneasy. Everything had made sense, but not entirely. There were still edges, fuzzy corners, details that didn't fully add up. She paused for a moment at the wrought iron gate, her eyes drifting to the dark silhouette of the cottage behind her. The wind had picked up, rustling through the branches of the nearby trees, and the distant sound of owls hooting in the night seemed oddly fitting. The case was done, the murderer revealed, but Miss Marple couldn't shake the feeling that something else was lurking in the background, something yet to be uncovered. Her fingers traced the cold metal of the gate as she pondered the last moments of Eleanor Fielding's confession. It had been so clear, so precise. The silver pin, the staged fire, the carefully planned disappearance. Eleanor had been a master at hiding in plain sight. And yet Miss Marple knew that the truth was rarely so neat. There was always a part of the story that remained untold. As she turned to leave, her gaze caught a small, nearly invisible detail. A scrap of paper caught in the ironwork of the gate. At first it seemed like nothing more than a wayward bit of litter, but the precise, almost deliberate placement of it made Miss Marple pause. She bent down, retrieving the small piece of paper, with a practiced hand, her fingers gently unfolding. It was just a corner, but the handwriting was unmistakable. The ink was faint, the letters shaky. Someone had written it in a hurry. A cryptic message, barely legible, read, "The past never stays buried. It always finds a way to resurface." The words sent a shiver down Miss Marple's spine. She hadn't noticed this earlier, and it was entirely possible that it had been placed there after Eleanor's departure, perhaps by someone else who knew too much. But the oddness of the message stayed with her. It could easily be a coincidence. A simple warning left by an overzealous soul, but somehow it felt more like an invitation, a challenge even. The case was over, yes, but there was an undercurrent that told her it was far from finished. Miss Marple stood up, folding the paper carefully and tucking it into the pocket of her coat. She looked back one last time at the cottage, its windows, now dark, its secrets tucked behind closed doors. Yet there was a lingering sense that whatever had been settled tonight was only part of a larger puzzle, one that had yet to be completed. The village lay quiet, but Miss Marple's mind was alive with possibilities. There were too many unanswered questions, too many connections that hadn't been fully explored. And as she walked away from Windmere Cottage, she couldn't shake the thought that the shadows of the past would continue to loom large over this place. Eleanor's deception had been uncovered, but who or what had been the true mastermind? The words on the scrap of paper hinted at something more sinister, something even deeper than a woman's desperate desire for control. With each step she took, Miss Marple couldn't help but feel the weight of unfinished business pressing down on her shoulders. It wasn't just about the people involved. It was about the hidden layers that always remained beneath the surface. The fabric of human nature was woven with threads of secrecy, and the deeper one looked, the more intricate the pattern became. As she reached the edge of the village, Miss Marple allowed herself one final glance toward the distant hills. The quiet peace of the night seemed at odds with the restless thoughts swirling in her mind. She had solved the case, yes, but there were always more questions lurking in the shadows. And then, as if to affirm her thoughts, a gust of wind blew through the trees, carrying with it a faint whisper, a reminder that no matter how many puzzles were solved, there would always be another to take its place, another mystery just waiting to unfold. Miss Marple smiled to herself, a soft, knowing smile. She had always known that the truth was never as simple as it seemed, and the most puzzling part of the game was never the crime itself. It was the way people hid their darkest secrets, how they danced around the truth, and how the past always found its way to the surface, no matter how much one tried to bury it. As she walked into the night, the only sound was the soft crunch of gravel beneath her feet, but in her mind the game was far from over. There were still threads to follow, still mysteries to untangle. Miss Marple had solved this one, but there were always more, hidden in the corners of the world, just waiting for someone with a keen eye to notice, and she would be there, as she always was, watching, waiting, and listening. Because for Miss Marple the mystery never truly ended. It simply evolved, like the ever-present shadows of the past.